Hello guys, this will be a short intro to this video, which is the first in series of videos which will tackle the problem of code structure in Laravel. And that is kind of an intro to upcoming online course I've just launched, well, pre-launched, it's still in progress, called How to Structure Laravel Code. I've decided to tackle that problem because it's really often, I see a lot of people asking, where do I put my stuff? So where do I put custom logic? Because it's pretty clear to have MVC, like controller, model, and view, but what about some other design patterns? Should I use repository or not? Where to put extra stuff in controller? Should it be some kind of service, some kind of other design patterns? What to use, how to make the controllers shorter, how to structure all of that. And there are various ways to do that. And I decided to analyze open source packages like this one in this video, and also provide some theory and practice and analysis in that online course. Some of those videos will be free on YouTube, some will be a part of that online course. If you want to enroll in that, the link is below. Good luck with watching the video, and I really want to hear your feedback. If you have watched that video, please tell me if it's useful. What packages should I analyze more, or what ideas do you have about code structure? What questions do you have? Comment on this video below, and I possibly will answer your questions or add some topics to the online course. Have fun watching the video. In this video, we will analyze an open source package, or rather project, called Akaunting. And the purpose of this video is to analyze its structure, the code structure, the architecture, the patterns that are used. So we can learn from the best solutions that are available on open source. And this is one of the better ones. It's on the market for more than a year. And it has, as you can see, 1,400 stars on GitHub. Really small amount of issues, and pretty well written. I've analyzed it offline, I've installed it, so this is how it looks, a dashboard for accountants. I'm not an accountant myself, so I cannot comment whether it works well from like accounting point of view, but I did analyze the code and the folders and the classes, and let's see how it is structured. In my Google Keep, I have notes, so this is kind of outline what you will see here in this video. So we will analyze Composer, what it contains, and then we will go from routes to controllers to models. So what is in routes file, how are controllers structured, what are private methods in controllers, and a lot of stuff. So jobs, some of the code is written in jobs, some of the code is in events and listeners. Then they also use traits quite a lot, which was a little surprising, but then it made sense why. They do use notifications function from Laravel. They use observer pattern, but only one observer. I will show you that. Then there's interesting pattern called overrides. So they override some basic classes, some core classes. Then there are utilities, which are used in installation commands and some installer functions. And then it's interesting to see how the tests are written, and specifically Cedar for the test. So we'll cover all of that. And as a bonus thing, so extra tools that are used, they use modules, Laravel modules package to structure the code. Then they use another package to filter Eloquent, which is also interesting. Then they use API, but since the package is Laravel 5.4. They didn't have the API resources available, so they use Dingo package with transformers. And final thing, we will discuss how they use public folder, which is not really typical. So all of that you will see in this video, and let's start from Composer. The package itself, if you go to accounting.com, I think it is, accounting.com, yeah, you can only download the package, so you cannot really clone from GitHub. Well, you can, but the recommended way is to download. And downloaded file, zip file, doesn't contain Composer, so you download it as a already pre-built thing. You don't have to install it. You don't need to do Composer install and all of that. It's done for you. It has visual installer. So Composer JSON is available only on GitHub here, but we can easily take a look at the code. And it's pretty big. There are a lot of packages used, but I want to pay your attention to a few things. First thing, Laravel 5.4, which is this. Then another thing I want to point out, look at all the stars here. So they specify which version of each package to use, and that's a really good practice, because if you leave like 3 point star or even just 3 point anything, if that package releases new version which is kind of a breaking version, breaking changes or some bugs introduced, then you might be screwed. But if you are tied to specific version, even that, like beta 8, so that is even more specific. But probably the third version, like after the second dot, is pretty safe to assume that version 2.3.19 would not break 2.3.1. So that is a really good practice. And then also it's a kind of a good practice if you have a huge application, or well, really large one, to have your own packages separate. So if you see, this is the package accounting/accounting, but underneath they have separate package for language, for money, for settings, for signed URLs, and for versions. And that is probably useful for them. So when you have a separate piece of code that you would like to specify to separate in a separate layer, have your own package is pretty good way to do that. I've seen various CMSs do that. Not sure, October CMS, I think, Typey CMS, they have like a base package, and then that package depends on a lot of other packages which are below. Even Laravel framework is actually not a Laravel framework, but it's a set of packages underneath. Even that, so Laravel framework, Laravel Tinker is a separate, and then there's more. That's probably it from Composer.json. That's what I've noticed. Also, there are a few things with PSR4, so overrides. That's interesting, and modules. That's interesting, but we will discuss that along the way in the video. And now let's get to our main controller, actually to routes. And then let's start with routes, then we go to controller, models, and see how it's all structured. Okay, here I am in the main routes web file, which is really interesting, grouped really well, and let's see what we can learn from here. And we will learn routes and middlewares as well. So routes are structured in groups, and that is a really good way to have a group within a group, and you have as many layers as you want, and specifically for using different middlewares. So in this example, everything, all the routes are middlewared by language, and I will show you what is language later. So everything is under language. And then there is a group for authenticated users, so middleware auth, which ends a little further here. So there are some public routes, like for installation. So this is authenticated users block. And then within that, we have groups for uploads, for wizard, for admin menu, and a lot of other like income. Then there's domain-specific things like expensive banking reports, and it's just for having prefixes in URLs, but some of them are under middleware. And let's get to middlewares. What are they? It's a mix in this package, in this accounting, it's a mix of middleware provided by Laravel, which is auth, and then permission read admin panel, which is they're using, what's the Composer.json, Lara Trust, I think it was. The package, yep, Lara Trust, it comes with permissions. And then the most interesting part is middleware language. I was trying to find what is language. Let's go to our kernel PHP, which usually is responsible for middlewares. And there are a lot of middlewares. And actually there are groups of middlewares. So wizard, admin, customer, and others. And there is language here. But what is language? If we're trying to find language middleware or something, there's nothing to be found. But then I realized that they use their own package. And how it works is in their Composer.json they have accounting language 1.0, and if we go to this package, there is a provider. In the main config app PHP, they have this. So among vendor service providers, they have their own language provider, which gets us to here. And in this service provider, they specify that alias middleware, alias language to config language middleware. It sounds pretty complicated, but it's kind of flexible. So then you need to look at config language middleware, and then again back to the main you have config language here, and in config language you find this, and then you can understand that this class is specifically responsible for this constant, for this middleware. And if we look at that set locale, it's probably responsible for just applying the languages, which is just setting the locale probably into sessions or date set locale, set default, set user locale, set system, and a lot of others. So yeah, it's pretty complicated for middlewares within the routes. And final thing, which will lead us to controllers. Let's see how they use controllers. So for most of the routes file, they don't use resource, which is kind of a weird thing, but sometimes it is more readable. So for example, currencies, create, edit, enable, disable, probably they would be able to use resource, but they decided to split it into more methods, like enable, disable isn't part of resourceful controllers. So this is probably more readable and more useful to them. But see that there are prefixes and namespaces for controllers. So they kind of divided controllers into many folders, specifically by domain, and there are specific for API, for common things, for installation, and a lot of that. And they use namespaces here in the routes pretty extensively everywhere. So every controller is namespaced with something. So that is also a good practice. But what I disagree with kind of is that they don't use controller name in the naming of the controller. So company's controller should be more appropriate, in my opinion, just because then we know that companies is a controller. So I imagine if you look at the whole project and search for companies, you will find a lot of things. Oh yeah, I was totally right. So there is a common, actually there are even separate controllers, so it's even more complicated. But there is a filter, there is a controller for this, for that, and model. There is a model in auth here with method companies. So I would kind of a great practice, in my opinion, to have currencies controller, companies controller, same with resource, not the resource, what was the request? I think they don't use requests as well. So request banking account, for example, extends request, I would call it account request, just for clarification, what is that file? So from the name of the file, you know what it is, controller, resource, or everything or anything else. So that is a brief overview of routes. Hope it was useful. Now let's go to controllers. Okay, let's pick some controller, and I've picked a dashboard, which corresponds to this view. When you log in, you see the dashboard, and that is probably one of the most complicated. It should be, with a lot of numbers. So let's see how it is structured. This is the route, and we go to common dashboard PHP. And let's start with index, and let's see how it is structured. It's pretty small, so index function calls some other functions, some calculations, get this, get that, and then returns the view, which is okay. Let's see some more internal things. Date comes from the package, I think it was something with date. What I'm interested in is this one. So what I'm noticing in the dashboard, at least controller, there are a lot of private methods. So this get totals is a private method, which in retrospect it calls another method which is also private, calculate this, calculate amounts, and in reality this controller has only like 50 rows, so up to 75th row is controller functions with public, like route processing routes methods, and everything else from 70th row to like 400 something. So 80% of the controller is private methods. So that's the part I would disagree. I would probably list that somewhere in service in some other layer. but it works, it's fine, it's okay, and it's readable. It's pretty much readable. So private function get totals, then it again it calls calculate amounts, and this is where we probably finish with controllers because we need to get to models. This line is pretty interesting. It seems like a normal eloquent call, category with, where, and then some other like enabled. There's a scope, we will get to that too. But what is a category? Category is an eloquent model, and that is fine, except, and that also looks pretty familiar, simple, eloquent, nothing too major. But extends model is a custom base model for the whole project, and that is really interesting. It extends eloquent, and it probably repeats a lot of eloquent magic, but in the base model there are a lot of kind of global project scoped things that are needed. So filter is used with a package for filtering, we will get to that, but for example, scope company ID. And that is a great idea because a lot of the functionality, imagine the accounting service, there are everywhere. There are filters by company ID, there are filters by enabled, whether the record is enabled or disabled, scope by account, and filtering by account, scope by customer, vendor, a lot of scopes. And in all the database table, I assume they have fields like enabled, like customer ID, like vendor ID, account ID, and it's a really convenient way to have a base model with base scopes and then use, for example, scope enabled in the dashboard in here like this. So enabled, and probably that enabled is repeated throughout other. Let me find it. Maybe there's something here. No, probably not in this specific controller, but I imagine it is repeated elsewhere, and that is a good way to have a base model. Well, this here, account enabled. Let's see if it extends the same. Yeah, so account extends model, which has scope enabled. So if you have any global scopes or global variables that you want to filter by, that's a great way to have it as a base model, which you then extend. Next thing I want to talk about is jobs. So folder jobs or jobs classes that they dispatch here in the package accounting. And the example is in controller expenses bills in store method. So create a bill. For that they chose the jobs. And this is the question which ultimately comes back, where do I put the code? In this case, so you're creating a bill, which is a substantial piece of code. Where do you put that? In controller, it's too big. In the model, it's too heavy for the model. So this is where people create some other layer. Usually, from my experience, it's services. But in this case, they chose jobs, and I will show you why. It kind of makes sense, but it could be a service as well. I think so, because the jobs are usually used when there's something to queue some jobs one by one. In this case, it's not queuable. It's not queuable anywhere, but it performs the job, so it makes sense to structure like that. So what does it do? This job, create a bill. It creates the bill with Eloquent. Bill is just an Eloquent model. There's nothing too interesting there. It attaches the file with probably Spotty Media Library, if I'm not mistaken, and then it calculates some totals. And for that, it creates another job. It dispatches another job, which is create bill item. So this is create bill, so full bill, and then create bill item is for item, which in itself calls bill item somewhere. Yeah, bill item create. Eloquent, again, Eloquent, some calculations, and then it returns bill item. Let's go back to our create bill job. So bill item is used then to calculate some totals, then discounts, then some totals more. That is an interesting thing. It overrides the request and then updates it with the request input. I'm not sure what is done here, why, but it works. Then we have this add totals, which is an interesting thing. It's a private method within the same job. So it adds the totals records into the database. It's actually a protected function, but it's pretty similar. So it adds bill total with Eloquent model, another bill total for discount, for taxes, so a lot of saving within Eloquent. It doesn't return anything, and then the main job also adds bill history. So I imagine from accounting point of view, you do have to save a lot of records, related records, just for accounting purposes. Then we have bill create recurring. So create recurring bill is actually a trade. And trade is considered to be kind of a bad practice or last resort if you don't have any other pattern. But it does make sense in this case because recurring can be a lot of things. It could be bill recurring, it could be expense recurring, or income recurring, as I understand from accounting point of view again. So it does make sense to have a trade and then call it from wherever you want. What's interesting here that create recurring and recurring trade isn't referenced in the job itself. So in this, you won't have recurring. It is referenced in the model. So app model expenses bill, if we click that one, this is where you find app trades recurring. So that is interesting. It's kind of referenced 2 levels deep. And final thing that is done within this job is the event. Event is fired, that bill is created. And I assume that the event will be responsible to send some notifications, maybe store some other data, and someone should listen to that. But the event itself is empty. As you can see, the constructor is really empty and there's nothing here. So let's find out where it is used, how it is used, and what classes actually listen to it. And the answer to this question, what the bill created is used for, is it's nowhere. It doesn't get used anywhere. If I search bill created throughout all the project, it's not attached to any listener. It doesn't have any listener. And usually you would find event service provider to tie the listeners. So listen which class with what listener. But bill created isn't in the list, which means that they kind of did that upfront in the job. They fire the event, so this one, which is empty for now, but just in case it is created. So for the future developers or for themselves, I guess, like for my future self, let's call it this way. But what we can find in event service providers is a few listeners that actually work, listeners and events. And particularly interesting is invoice paid. So invoice paid event is listened by invoice paid listener, which is, I'm not, again, I will repeat, I'm not a fan of this this naming of the class. It should be paid listener because it doesn't, it's not clear by file name what the file actually does. So I would rename it. But anyway, let's get to paid PHP, which is this listener. And in this listener, you have actually handle, invoice paid as event. Actually, let's take a look at invoice paid where it's actually being called invoice paid, event new. So PayPal standard, it's in controller, it's actually in modules, which we'll touch a little later. So it's a separate modules package, which calls that event with parameter of invoice and request, and then it gets to that listener, which is paid here. So invoice and request gets throughout these 2 parameters, and then there are some magic stuff happening with invoice paid. And again, listener has its own protected or private function to perform some action, and then so create payment as this protected method. And that is an interesting question. When should you have private methods or protected methods? Probably it is to shorten the main function. So instead of this being 100 lines, it is kind of a 30 lines, well, not 100, but 20 lines of code are extracted, refactored into separate function. And that does make sense. I agree with that. And also within that listener, it finally calls the notification. So user notify about invoice being paid. Let's see what is notification. A notification is actually this one. And that's another instance where I don't agree with the naming, because that line shouldn't exist. That line should be invoice notification. So something like that, and then it's all clear that invoice notification is actually a notification class. As it stands here, it is notification, and then we need to click to find out what it does. And this is a standard notification by Laravel. I think it was introduced in 5.3 or 5.4. It sends the email with attaching the PDF file for the invoice. So this is how it works with the events and listeners. And also in the modules, we will touch that a little later. But every module, it has two modules, offline payment and PayPal standard. It has their own listeners. So listen, no, not this one. So for example, their own providers. So module PayPal standard has PayPal standard service provider, which registers listeners like this one. So it's even more complicated. There are a few listeners for the main application, and also there are a few listeners for each module. Next part of that application, accounting, I want to show you is observers. And there is one observer for model company, and it looks like this. So the purpose of that is when the company is created, there is artisan call command to seed some company data and attach a company to the user, to the logged in user. And then another method is when the company is deleted, then delete items, like listed here, a lot of data related to the company. It's kind of a cascade delete, but done in Observer. And if we search in the code for observe, it's attached in Observer Service Provider. So that's another interesting thing. They use quite a lot of service providers, which then are registered in PHP, which is Observer Service Provider. So they don't pick, they don't specify this line in App Service Provider as I would do that, but specifically for observers, they create their own provider. Next interesting thing, well, I call all them interesting things or patterns in the accounting package, is utilities. So app utilities folder contains some classes. For example, class installer. Basically, from what I understand, the logic why it is called utilities and not services, not anything, it's mostly about some common things like housekeeping, like installing, uninstalling, versioning, info, some importing of data. So kind of it kind of makes sense to call it a utility and not a service, because for other things, as I mentioned before, they use jobs a lot, so a lot of jobs, but jobs are related to expense and income, and utilities are kind of system-wide global things. So for example, and it's simple class, so class installer, and they use static functions, so without any pattern, too much logic, injections or anything like that. Check server requirements, and it's checking in any variables, extensions of PHP, then something with env file, database, variables, create companies, some settings, and a lot of static methods basically. And it is called from artisan command. There is console command, quite a few commands as well. Most of them are also kind of utility things, so class install. As I mentioned before, they have visual installer in accounting, so it's not composer install something, you download the zip file and you use like WordPress visual installer. So there is a command with a lot of potential parameters, and inside of that command, in handle method, you would see a lot of installer. So installer create this, installer create that, create company, create users, check options, and a few more installer calls. So yeah, create DB tables. If we search for install something, installer. Oh yeah, so nothing more. But anyway, inside of console commands, like module install, there should probably be module installed event, and module history. No, in this case it's not using utilities, but anyway, you get the point. So utilities are classes that are not related to domain like accounting or expenses or income, but related to installing and some general info, which are then used mostly in console commands. Final thing I want to show you from app folder, final kind of pattern, it's called overrides. And I haven't used that myself before, I haven't seen that pattern, but it's really interesting again. Let's take a look at their Composer JSON. In Composer JSON they have PSR4, not PSR4, autoload app overrides. Let's get into that app overrides, and they have two classes, Accounting signed URL and Illuminate message selector. And what it does, basically, it overrides the core functions of Laravel into those classes. So with this pattern, they kind of change, for example, for signed URL, as I understand, they apply their own logic for expiration, for signature, for key, so configurable variables instead of core Laravel stuff. And if we search for signed URL in our project, signed URL, you would see some caching, offline payment. So offline payment class, which is inside of modules, use signed URL. So signed URL is part of core Laravel, but in this case it doesn't use the core Laravel. Instead it uses overrides thing. This is how it looks in I'll show you in autoload class map. So this is the part that it gets overridden. So instead of accounting signed URL, it uses overrides thing. And in this case they override their own signed URL, but in other case Illuminate message selector gets overridden, message selector, Illuminate translation. Interesting part is that in message selector the namespace remains the same, so it's kind of Illuminate, but in reality it's used in overrides. And I don't necessarily agree with this approach, because imagine as a new developer I come up with this code base and I need to signed URL. I need to understand that. I open this controller and I see use signed URL, and I assume that it's part of core Laravel, which isn't the case. So I need to understand that in Composer JSON it gets overridden by some other class. So I don't necessarily agree with that pattern, but as long as it works, and probably authors had some thought about it. Now let's take a look how Accounting package does testing, automatic testing. If we look at tests folder, there's nothing in unit, so there are no unit tests, but there are a lot of feature tests, which basically means that they log in as some user, perform some action on some route, and assert that the status is good enough. So 200 or 302 in this case, so test quite a lot of feature tests basically. But what I wanna pay attention to is how they seed the data for those tests. So feature test case is the main class, abstract class, and in setup, parent setup for test case, they call artisan commands. They call a simple seeding with class test company. Test company is here. So for every company, they create a company, some private methods. So create company is here. Yeah, so create a company with domain test.com, change some settings for the currency, for the address and all that, and then create one user. So they create one company and one user. And then separately they call company seed, which is another artisan command. Let's take a look at that, company seed. Why is it a separate artisan command? Laravel make abstract company seeder. Company seeder, another seeder for the company. And this is interesting pattern or interesting way. They call a lot of seeds related to the company. Where are they? Database seeds here. So account seeder, categories, currencies, and a lot of that. And each of those classes has argument. So argument company, and that is really convenient to have company seeder. Wait, where is that called? Lost little test company. No, not that one. Yeah, this one. Set command this company seeder, and at some point, don't remember where exactly. Company seeder. They run those commands with company ID equals 1. Oh, right, this one. So in main test case, they run company seed with parameter company equals 1, which then gets into this one automatically inside of the actual seeder. So that's a great way if you have a lot of seeders for one global variable. In this case, it's a company. It may be a global user or global, I don't know, some other organization or something like that, or domain name. So that is quite a great way to separate those into separate seeders. Then have one main seeder for all of them, expecting one parameter which could be passed from artisan call, in this case from test case. And finishing thoughts about test cases and feature tests. There are quite a lot of them, as I said, and they are divided into various kind of sections, so expenses, incomes, but they are all pretty similar. Assert status and assert 302, which is enough to be sure that the project is working and it's not breaking with various types of data. So if we get the request, it fakes some data using Faker, which is really well-known package, and then basically I would write pretty much the same amount of tests, because the usual question is what tests to write, how to structure them, do we write unit tests or not. Of course it depends, but in this case this suite of tests is good enough to basically sleep well at night and almost be guaranteed that the main structure, the main CRUDs, the main get and post routes are working well. Okay, and in the last chapter of our video, it's time to wrap up with modules, with packages, external packages that are used by accounting. And I will mention 3 of them. Really briefly, I don't want to get too deeper into that. Maybe I'll shoot separate videos on those, but still, they need your attention. They deserve your attention. First one is modules by Nicholas Wittard, Laravel modules. It's pretty simple, but at the same time complex package. To structure your code into separate modules. So in this case, you're creating a module, just module make, and then you can create folder modules and name your module, and then do pretty much the same structure as it would be your Laravel app, the full app. So database, HTTP, resources, controllers, migrations, config, anything you want here. The only thing you actually need is to make it in Composer JSON PSR4, which is done exactly by the accounting package. Here you can see PSR4 modules, and in this case they have 2 modules, both related to payment, so PayPal standard. An interesting thing that they have routes, so every module has its own routes with its own namespaces and whatever they need. So it's kind of convenient. I'm still not sure if I would do that, if I would structure the module into a separate folder, like totally separate. But in this case, probably the module offline payment only works with that domain, with that offline payments, and PayPal standard is only working with PayPal. So it does make sense. If you want to check out the Laravel modules package, it's pretty popular, and it has version 4 already. And now let's move to another package that is used in accounting. It's Eloquent Filter. Haven't seen that before, found it just here from the accounting, and it seems to be a useful package, again with 500 stars. What it does, it allows you to filter Eloquent records, not by this huge list of where clauses. For example, if you have mega search, search by query, search by drop-down, search by something else. And this is how it usually looks like in controller. So a lot of where statements, a lot of if, where has, and a lot of those. And with this package you can put it to the array, and then that filter takes care of everything inside of the filter. And this is how it's used in the package in the accounting itself. So you can just, if we get back to documentation, you just make a filter. Where's the command? Yeah, so autism model filter, and then in the filter you have the method for each of the where statements. So where search by, where vendors, categories, statuses, and bill date. And in the accounting blade, there's a form with these exact parameters. So search is a text query, then vendors and categories are drop downs, and then date range is bill date. But this is camel case, no, not camel case, underscore with underscore, snake case, and this is camel case. So that's important part to remember. But in general, it's a useful thing to avoid filtering in controller. And final external package I want to mention here, but really briefly, is Dingo API. It's used in older Laravel versions, and if you notice that in some code base, app transformers, it's basically for API to return some model and transforming it into some, for example, ISO string with some other operations. And since Laravel 5.5, it was changed to API resources, which became a part of Eloquent. So you just make a resource and you just specify the array like this instead of using any external package. So that is it. My plan is over here. So we've reviewed the accounting package, which took much longer than I expected. I expected it to be like 10-15 minutes. It became like 40, I think. But I'm really curious, was it useful? Was it just me talking to the camera and just analyzing stuff, or was it actually useful to you? Did you find out anything new? Please add your comments. And if that is successful, then I will review more packages, more projects from open source, and we will both learn from them. See you guys in the next videos.